Hey, it's Jordan. I am delighted to be joined by Norman Solomon. He is the co-founder, national director of Roots Action, as well as pretty prolific, I'd say, journalist, activist, media critic. I've actually followed you for Sanity on Russiagate, among other things. So I wanted to talk to you because your group, Roots Action, currently really pushing a bill proposed by Senator Ed Markey, Congressman Ro Khanna, to stop the madness and to basically divert funds that are going to continue the nuclear missile buildup and instead stop that and send that money for vaccine production and distribution during the still ongoing pandemic. Can you kind of give the audience a background, Norm, on what Senator Markey and Ro Khanna's bill is proposing?
Well, I often think of something that Martin Luther King Jr. described as, quote, the madness of militarism. And I think you can't find a better and more horrible example of that madness than the intercontinental ballistic missiles that the United States and Russia have. There's a nuclear triad, air, sea, and land. And of the three, having nuclear missiles on the land is just the worst possible way because unlike air and sea, there's a danger or a perceived danger that the armaments could be subjected to a first strike. So there's sort of a use them or lose them hair trigger mentality that sets in just minutes for the leader of a country to decide whether or not to launch nuclear missiles. Could be a flock of geese, could be incoming. We don't know in that situation. So this bill is crucial because Ed Markey in the Senate and Ro Khanna in the House have put together legislation that would say enough of this craziness. I mean, that's my wording. They're saying we shouldn't be pouring hundreds of billions of dollars more into so-called modernizing these land-based nuclear missiles when meanwhile, not only are they making us less safe, they're also diverting huge amounts of money from, in this case, COVID relief.
Right. And by the way, poverty in March soared to a high during the pandemic. I mean, this is, I'm just reading from NBC News, but for some of the most marginalized populations, the rate of poverty in March was even higher than a year ago. And this is after the COVID relief bill. We got all the media talking points was cutting poverty in half, which, is kind of temporary because none of the measures in the COVID relief bill were permanent. They were all temporary. So while poverty is soaring, while most of the jobs that have returned have been in, restaurants, bars, like under living wage, we still have this economic crisis, still have increasing poverty, yet this program alone is nearly $100 billion.
Massive funding for the Pentagon is never temporary. It's always ongoing. It's a bottomless pit. Whereas, as you point out, even these temporary stimuluses don't do much as the months and then years go by. And this is really part of the challenge. And progressive movements really need to come to grips with this because, yes, there's been tremendous progress in organizing at the grassroots, on the ground, and in terms of consciousness and political pressure around racism. At the same time, we have this other problem of will the world be destroyed by nuclear weapons and militarism quickly through nuclear war or just more gradually through siphoning away money that needs to be going instead to meeting human needs. The former progressive congressperson, now departed, Ron Dellums, used to say that nuclear weapons are equal opportunity destroyers. And this effort by the now Biden administration to, on the one hand, advance some moderately progressive programs economically is paralleled by a sort of deranged willingness to continue a path towards not only more and more militarism, but nuclear Armageddon.
And I'd like to ask you in the broader context, because Trump pulled out of several of the treaties we had on nuclear missiles. So Biden got in, I think has done better on that regard than Trump, who I believe was pretty reckless. But on the same token, Biden just proposed a military budget that was greater than Trump's, $753 billion, which they say they have to increase for the grave threat of China now. So everything's being redirected in the Biden administration towards China. Meanwhile, we still have the Cold War rhetoric against Russia. So on one end, we have at least a verbal commitment that we're going to pull out of Afghanistan, which is good. I would caution, they said we're totally out of Iraq. Then we find out we still have thousands of troops in Iraq. What do you decipher from, on one end, the president says he's pulling troops out of Afghanistan, but on the other end, increase of the military budget, and this program Senator Markey and Ro Khanna are fighting against, which is more money towards nuclear missiles?
There's really a sharp difference between the domestic programs of the Biden administration that have been moving us certainly in a very good direction overall, and foreign policy, which is status quo. It's continuing the insanity of the Trump priorities, and frankly, Obama before, but Trump was worse than his predecessor. And now the trajectory is just being extrapolated out in the real world by the Biden administration, as you say, even pushing to increase this out of control military spending even more so. And a lot of the problem comes down to that the rhetoric is not matched by the reality. If you look at the Biden foreign policy, there's a couple of really major good things: rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and getting back into the START arms control agreement with Russia. But that's just very basic stuff. Trump canceled the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty, which was a big victory of the peace movement in the 1980s. These European-based missiles that were pointing in both directions had been outlawed. Well, we don't see any movement towards restoring that treaty from Biden. There's a very aggressive stance through NATO rhetorically in terms of troop movements and military exercises that Biden is cheering on. And even the positive campaign plank that Biden had to restore the Iran nuclear deal, which was one of the few important foreign policy achievements of the Obama administration, all sorts of roadblocks now are being thrown into that restoration by the Biden administration itself. As we speak, negotiations are really being sort of gummed up by the Biden people towards Iran. So really the hawks are largely in charge of Biden foreign policy.
And something that you've written a lot about has been basically this charade that Russia swung the election for Trump in 2016, that instead of the Democratic Party actually focusing on what are the reasons you lost to a game show host, they made Russia the boogeyman, which I've been saying since 2016. Does Russia try to interfere? Yeah, I don't think any more than we try to interfere with them and other countries' elections. But what I find really interesting is you would think after Biden won, we suddenly, Russia didn't try to interfere with the election as much when the Democrats won. That talk kind of decreased. But they're building up these nuclear missiles while Biden's talk against Russia remains the same. I think that's very dangerous because who knows, in 2024, could you have a President Tom Cotton or one of these really extreme right-wingers that are more competent than President Trump was with this built-up nuclear arsenal, and the Democrats have paved the way for this Cold War tension and hysteria with Russia.
There's really a buildup of the hostile rhetoric coming out of Washington towards Russia and the buildup more of nuclear weapons without any sort of sense of even what in his last months President John F. Kennedy was so articulate about. If we don't find ways to have peaceful coexistence, then what is, quote unquote, the end game here? For 5 years, we've been subjected from the Democratic Party establishment this massive rhetorical barrage against Russia. And the fact is, if you look historically, and I carry no torch for Putin, there's a lot that's wrong with how he rules in Russia. But if you look at what has happened historically, there was a promise from the first President Bush not to expand NATO, and instead a dozen countries have been absorbed into NATO right up against Russia's border. And it's just, the double standard is so extreme. I think there's a dozen overseas military bases from Russia. There are 800 from the United States. There's one from China. And yet, as the saying used to go, butter won't melt in our mouth. Uncle Sam is this, pure, faultless person. When we have flaws at home, they're anomalies. Whereas in Russia, it's systemic. Yeah, there's a lot of injustice systemic in Russia. We don't have actually perfection here as well. And so this rhetorical game that went on so much during the Cold War that pushed the world and kept the world on the precipice of nuclear annihilation. What is the point of all this coming from Democratic Party leaders in the United States? When you talk with people, progressives often, who are on this anti-Russia bandwagon, I think it's important to ask, where does this lead? It leads towards greater and greater risk towards nuclear conflagration.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask you, because to me, I look at just the ridiculous insanity during the Democratic primary. The media always pushes this line. Well, how are you going to pay for it? And even Biden proposing the COVID relief bill during a deadly pandemic. Well, how are you going to pay for it? Now the infrastructure proposal Biden's made, which is, to me, a Band-Aid for a gaping gunshot wound, which is the climate catastrophe. $2 trillion is completely insufficient. So how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? But I don't know. Senator Markey Ro Khanna, they're trying to stop this $93 billion nuclear missile program, this nuclear missile buildup. I don't hear the media saying crickets about how you're going to pay for this nuclear missile buildup, or how you're going to pay for the $751 billion Biden wants for the defense budget, or all of these things that make Raytheon money, Lockheed Martin, Wall Street, which is invested in a vibrant, massive military. There's never any discussion about how you're going to pay for it when it comes to military, nuclear buildup, all this stuff. When, I don't know, a lot of those F-35 fighter pilot jets and stuff, you could feed a lot of people in struggling cities with the money going towards those.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Martin Luther King used to say that the bombs in Vietnam exploded home. And what he meant is that economically, as well as culturally and psychologically, when you have an economy so rooted in violence and militarism, you're depleting the resources elsewhere. And you're also culturally and psychologically attuning people more to destruction than sustaining life. And as you point out, we have a tremendous task ahead if we're going to have healthcare, education, housing in our own society, environmental protection. So the priorities are skewed and backwards. They continue to be. And it's incumbent upon progressives, and however we describe ourselves politically, if we have humane values, we want to improve this country and the world, then it's crucial to challenge whoever's in power who has the priorities upside down. And I should mention at rootsaction.org, we fought very hard to get Bernie Sanders elected president. And when that was unsuccessful and it was clear it was Biden, we launched a Vote Trump Out campaign, realizing that in swing states, it was necessary to vote for Biden to prevent a second disastrous Trump term. We always said, vote Trump out and then challenge Biden. And that is essential right now, or we're just going to slip back into a morass that values militarism and corporate profits instead of human needs.
And, it's a good segue. Do you think the progressives in the House and the Senate are fighting Biden enough? I mean, listen, I'm a Bernie guy, just like the next guy. But I got to acknowledge, President Manchin over here and President Sinema, these are two people. But progressives in the House, including Congressman Khanna, who I like, you got 7 to 10, I would say, capital P progressives that really could say, I'm not voting for your infrastructure package. I'm not voting for X, Y, and Z without you giving me, ABC. But we don't really see that hardball. We see it from Manchin, the Kristen Sinemas, even some of Biden's cohorts from Delaware, Chris Coons, Tom Carper. What do you attribute to that? Do you think that the progressives in the House, maybe Bernie included, need to pull a little Manchin and say, no, if we don't get certain things, we're not going to vote for insufficient packages?
I think those are technical, or often you might say tactical challenges within the Congress. I do think that progressives need to pressure members of the squad and others who are generally aligned with us in the House and Senate to say, we're not just giving you a pass. We insist that not only what you say, but what you do be consistent with your and our values. And that means that sometimes, as you say, playing hardball with somebody of your own party in the White House is absolutely essential. One of those lines in the sand, if you will, should be on military spending. I mean, it's absolutely unacceptable to fail to reduce military spending, which is really way over $1 trillion a year when you take the Department of defense in quotes, budget, and add to it nuclear weapons, which is outside of the Pentagon spending, et cetera. So this is just outrageous. And I would like to see progressives in Congress, for instance, say, we're digging in our heels and we're not going to help you on other stuff until we finally cut the military budget.
Right. And bringing it back to how could people get involved? Roots Action is helping right now to push Senator Markey and Congressman Khanna's proposal. It is called Cures Before Missiles Act. Basically, they're trying to divert this $93 to $96 billion that is being spent on more nuclear missiles, trying to take that money and put it towards vaccine distribution. How can people get involved that believe that money should go towards vaccine distribution and other things?
Well, thousands of supporters of rootsaction.org have already emailed and otherwise contacted their members of the House and Senate in support of the Markey-Khanna bill, which is shorthanded as the ICBM Act. And everybody's invited to sign up for action alerts and to take that action in particular by joining us at rootsaction.org.
Great. I appreciate it, Norm. We'll have to have you back to talk other things. Norm Solomon, co-founder of rootsaction.org. Thanks again.
Hey, thank you, Jordan. I appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.